This is the Permission to Write podcast, and I'm your host, Ashley M. Coleman, author of Good Morning Love. Join us each week as writers discuss more than writing. You'll hear from me as well as the occasional guest on craft, publishing, life, and culture. We hope you enjoy the show. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Permission to Write podcast. We are going to jump into our show and talk about some news stories for this week in publishing. So Lisa Lucas is out at Pantheon and seemingly taking it in stride, but we the people are mad as hell, okay? We were all just talking about how wonderful Lisa Lucas is as a publisher, only to find the news that with a reorganization at Penguin, she is out as the publisher of Pantheon. At the helm of the imprint since 2020, Lucas ushered in acts like Laura Worrell, LeVar Burton, reading Rainbow, y'all, Nana Kwame, among so many others. And we cannot fathom what reorganization would have her out. So we're hoping that she lands somewhere back in books because, quite frankly, we need her. Following the leaving of Dana Kennedy from Simon & Schuster, now Lisa at Pantheon, it just kind of feels a little nuts in the publishing world, especially when it comes to Black women in publishing that we need. Also in the news, Bertelsmann has partnered with Enders Analysis and Arthur D. Little to publish a new report on the state of play, exploring generative AI's transformation effects on the media and entertainment industries. So the report examines examples of how AI is already in use and analyzes different models and their potential impact on particular businesses, including book publishing. A few places that AI is already showing up so far in publishing include content creation, copy editing, and sales and marketing. So AI is here. I know I have been taking my time in regard to how to utilize ChatGPT for other things, not my writing, but just kind of administrative, all the things that we have to do. But I'm scared, y'all. I'm scared. I don't want to be left behind, but I'm also scared of AI. And I think we're all still trying to figure it out. In addition, Rebecca Shinsky, and sorry if I am butchering that, but she shared on her Today in Book Substack that the state of publishing from the inside. This is where she recounted some highlights from the 2024 Publishers Weekly U.S. Book Show. That essentially the state of the union is within publishing is that audiobooks are up and changing the way that people consume books, while sales are dipping from the pandemic boom, but seemingly still strong. And diverse books are faring well, even with all of the unraveling of a lot of the work that's happening in 2020, but we'll get into that later. That happened in 2020. And AI is the elephant in the room, right? So everybody's kind of trying to figure out what's going to happen in terms of AI. So as always, we'll link to the stories in our show notes, but we're very excited to have a guest for our season 2, our next guest for season 2. We started out, of course, with Dr. Sheena Howard. And so we have a next guest. So getting into this week's topic, I really wanted to discuss writing through a cultural lens unapologetically and what that really means, right? And to do so, I have invited a guest to chat with me. Jade Olivia is here with us, who is a talented fiction writer with a forthcoming book, A Month of Sundays, that's available June 2nd to discuss it. So Jade, come on and join me on this wonderful day.
Hi, Ashley.
Hi, Jade. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Yes, and I am excited to have you. So I feel like Jade and I have been connected for a very long time now. Sometimes when I'm like referencing, I'm like my OGs that have just been like riding with me on this writing journey, and also a fellow Philly alum. So yeah, Jade and I are going to get into it. So I just wanted to give a little background, a little context on this concept that we're going to be talking about today. And essentially, I was somewhere I shouldn't shouldn't have been. I was on Goodreads. And if you know anything about Goodreads, you know that as an author, you probably should not be on there because there are lots of reviews and there's wonderful reviews, but there's sometimes not great reviews as well. But one of the things that I saw when I was just down in the alley of Goodreads where I shouldn't have been was someone referencing how the characters spoke in Good Morning Love. And it really dawned on me how, as writers, oftentimes, even when you're in the querying process, you get very vague statements sometimes like, I didn't identify with the characters. And that gets troubling sometimes to separate as a Black writer, as a writer of color, what that actually means, because you can be unsure whether that means that there's a craft deficiency there, right? Like maybe something that you're not hitting home within the craft of your characters versus like, you just don't identify with Black people. Let's just keep it real. This is the Keep It Real literary podcast, okay? It can sometimes be hard to decipher. And so I just started thinking about that. And I feel like, we shouldn't read reviews, but sometimes you just happen upon them. And so I wanted to just chat with you about what that all really means in your world. I was like, I gotta invite another writer to have this conversation with me. And so I'm so glad to have Jade to kind of just like wax poetic on this concept with me. So I feel like with so much happening in publishing, even like the recent outing of Lisa Lucas at Pantheon, which we talked about a little bit earlier, what do you think is going on here? Like, is it giving we're trying to make publishing great again vibes? Like,
yeah, it's so interesting because Lisa is definitely, she's kind of been the literary gem, so to speak, for a number of years now, and rightfully so. She's absolutely incredible. Fun fact, she actually started out as an intern at Vibe magazine when she was a teenager. So speaking of culture, she's been in the culture for a very long time. And so she certainly, rightfully so, has the voice. And she certainly, her ascension into the industry is like so needed and so necessary and really is not a surprise. But what I can appreciate about Lisa, and I think it's something that she, believe it or not, really is teaching a lot of us who want to get into this publishing space, is that whatever decision is ultimately made isn't all the way good, nor is it all the way bad. So I think that, her outing and the announcement of it, if you notice on Twitter, she didn't air out the publishing house. She wasn't, wrecking bottles and cursing people out. And,
right.
She was very much, she took the road of, if I belong in publishing and it's something that is that where I'm supposed to be, I'm only going to go into the spaces where I'm needed. I'm only going to go into the spaces that, are open for me. And so I think that, yes, it is sad and it's unfortunate. And again, I don't know her personally, so I can't, vouch for how she's truly feeling. But I do think that from her perspective, I think in publishing, nothing is absolute. And I think that she's showing a side that really is encouraging for me as a writer, because yes, it may not be being in a traditional publishing space right now, but that doesn't mean that it never will be, and I think that her, being in this open space now where she clearly loves books, she clearly is well respected in the industry. Like LeVar Burton was like tweeting like, oh my God, I lost my publisher. Like, what is happening? So Lisa is a big deal. So, and I'm sure she will absolutely land on her feet and it will be something even bigger than probably she even imagined. And so, I mean, again, looking to her as kind of that North Star, I am encouraged, because at the same time, it can be very easy for us to look at publishing as like doomsday. I think sometimes the narrative around publishing is kind of based off of those who may not have gotten exactly what they wanted out of it. And so I think there's a slight little case of resentment. And rightfully so, because there are so many experiences that we clearly saw during the pandemic. We clearly saw the freaking, polar opposites of advancements and advances that these authors who we love, who we respect, were getting. And so it's like their experiences of wanting to get to these big houses, they're not being rightfully paid. Like, it is crazy across the board how kind of unsettled publishing seems. But it's interesting because as a writer, I personally do want to work in the industry. And so I can't like gleefully await its demise either. I don't want it to totally, I don't want it to
implode,
totally, implode and like explode and just vanish out of thin air. And so, I think publishing is in influx. And I think that's the nature of the beast, really. I'm not sure if there's one straight answer of where publishing will go. I do think there needs to be more of, I do think they need to lean a little bit harder in the idea of being more transparent with their audience, or the audience, especially with authors who want to have these huge publishing deals, who want to get the support. Because I think the biggest attraction that sometimes doesn't happen is authors who we admire, who we love. They are transparent in saying that sometimes I didn't get the support from my publisher or my editor. I was kind of left in the dark. And it's just like, really, you? Like, we love you. We didn't realize that you didn't have the support that you thought you would. And so I think publishing does have to come into a place where the writers who are obviously trying to get into these spaces, they need to have the support from the publishing houses if that's exactly what they want to sign up for. And so it's an interesting space that we're in, for sure, in publishing.
Yeah, I mean, you said a lot of great things. One, just the flexibility of it, right? Like understanding that there's ebbs and flows. And I think that's really important, especially because, to your point, there are no guarantees in publishing. So take it from a writer that is currently on submission and very nervous about what it means to be on submission with another book after having published my debut. And, maybe sometimes even like a debut feels easier because you don't have a track record. So you're like, you don't really know where your book fared, as a debut, because you're like, well, you got a lot of great opportunities, but you weren't like National Book Club, right? So it's like, where do you, how are people going to digest that? But so there's no guarantees for sure. I think the other thing too, I also don't know Lisa personally at all. I am friends with one of her authors, who absolutely kind of speaks her praises. But, I, personally felt like that idea of like a North Star, I think specifically existing as Black women within publishing, within writing. And for me, existing as like an urban Black woman, like, like from an urban background and being in publishing, I felt like it was important because I was like, I would just be following Lisa on Twitter and seeing like rap lyrics. And I'm like, yes,
yes.
like
no, she was very like accessible. Home. Yeah, she was very accessible. And that's another thing too. It didn't feel like she was on high somewhere, like looking down at her minions. It was like she felt very like intertwined with us. And I think that's also part of the heartbreak too, right? Because it's just like, man, she, it felt like we were there with her, so I completely get that.
Yeah. And part of the reason that Permission to Write exists is really this idea of like, you can sit with us, sometimes being in spaces where maybe I can only speak for myself, but like there have been literary spaces that I've been in that I was like, I don't know if I belong here. And so it's all about that accessibility, all about sharing, like you mentioned, what are real experiences. Sometimes I do hear about publishing stories and I'm like, this is crazy. I even hear stories about writers that I'm like, oh, writers are nuts. Like sometimes like writers being super like rude and just a lot of things. And I'm like, so far, so good for me, because I'm just like, I'm coming from the music industry. So I'm just like, this is going down in publishing because I get it in music, but like, writers.
Oh yeah.
But so I guess getting into that, like, some of what I feel like stands out to me about this idea of people in positions of power in publishing is like the fact of, not that a Black experience is a monolith, of course, but like you do feel like the more gatekeepers that have that experience, the better chances of our books kind of having people that do relate to the character or do understand kind of where we're coming from. So I guess when we talk about this idea of like writing through a cultural lens, what does that even mean to you? Because I feel like it could mean something different for everybody.
I think writing from a cultural lens, no matter what, writing on the cultural lens for me means writing on the pulse. So culture, just as a definition, it's constantly changing, right? So like the culture that was 10, 15 years ago is completely different than the culture that we have now. And specifically talking about a culture lens now, I think the commonality between both changes, no matter what culture we're in, is that writing from that lens, there's no denying about what's current. So there's no sort of like denial of like the forces that be that are kind of like overtaking our kind of social conversation. We talk about social media, we're talking about AI, we're talking about on more of a serious level, like politics and what that means kind of in our everyday and what that looks like. What does protesting and the threat of actually taking away protesting, what that looks like. And so if you're deciding to write from a cultural lens, you have to be kind of in favor of being real about the moment without and kind of doing away with being palatable, if that makes sense. Like, it's like you're very kind of seeped into, okay, this is what our culture is now. And writing from that space is such a privilege because it can almost be used as a capsule, a capsule of like a specific time. I think about like, I guess I call them like my foremothers. So like a Terry McMillan and kind of those authors who we love. Like that's a specific canon and it reflects a specific cultural lens that when I read it, I can relate to those characters now as a 30-something-year-old woman. But their specific, I guess, how they thought about certain topics, how they thought about certain things was filtered through that specific lens at that time. And so it's a privilege to do it. And honestly, I don't think it's something that me personally, I sit down and say, this is what I'm going to write now. I think it just kind of comes from naturally being a writer and observer of the world.
Yeah, you bring up two really good things there in that one, kind of what's surrounding us at the time. So it makes me think about the fact that I very consciously have skipped the pandemic when it comes to my writing. So I'm just like, I want to write about before the pandemic and I want to write about after the pandemic. And
pandemic does not exist.
That is very much a creative choice of just being like, I don't want to write about masks. I don't want to write about being in the house. Like, I just don't want to do it. You know what I mean? And that's a just a creative choice. I think one of my stories, I was like, it's going to be 2019 because I was just like trying to literally avoid, just that like next year. But then the other aspect of what you said is this idea of like showing up to the page like authentically. And so while I definitely didn't sit down to think this is how I'm going to portray something, it definitely, there were certain elements that I did get hindered by. So one of them being, I think in some early drafts, I had some feedback where like, maybe I put in like a substitute for a curse word and someone was like, I really feel like you want to say a curse word here. And it's kind of weird that you didn't, And I was just like, oh, and that was just like a certain lack of authenticity. And then also I feel like for Black authors specifically, even the idea around the N-word and like whether to use it or not, because especially these characters would, and that authenticity. But as the facilitator of the story, as the vessel of telling the story, you are thinking not only Black people are going to read this story, right? And so having those really difficult conversations with yourself, which I hate having, because to your point, it really we just should be able to show up to it, right? Like show up to the work as authentically as possible. But these are real conversations at times that you feel that some of us have with ourselves in trying to really, like you said, just like show up as ourselves and not worry too much about how other people receive us. And so where I do feel very comfortable is knowing like I write stories about Black people and either you're on board or you're not, right? Yeah. You know what I'm saying? Kind of much to, you talked about the four mothers, kind of like very much to Toni Morrison, like, you can get on the train or you could watch the next one come by, right? That's what it is. So I guess that like really leads me to this thought around like, whether you ever feel a responsibility to write through that lens. And so I guess like for clarity purposes, I'm thinking of like the idea of you where a lot was swirling around about Robin Lee writing white characters. There was kind of some misinformation about her story to publishing but I feel like there was something swirling around, like she had written other books with Black characters that didn't get picked up. And then The Idea of You, which like recently got made into a film, was the one that kind of broke through. Or, writing in the romance space. At a certain point, I was reading more romance because it was a genre I was being put into. And I thought, all these characters seem to be Black women and white men. And I didn't understand whether that was just the story, which is perfectly fine to show up. If that's the authentic story that you're trying to tell, there's tons of interracial relationships that are wonderful, to recount and deserve their space too. But because there were so many, I started to wonder if it was a trend to be more palatable to a larger audience. So all that to say, like, is there a responsibility for us to write through a cultural lens? It is fiction. Do we get to just think of other things? I don't know. I just want to kind of get your input. You've been so insightful on this whole thing, but do you ever feel any responsibility towards that, to write through like an authentic lens?
I do. I put it this way. I don't sit down. If I sat down and like consciously thought about, okay, I have this responsibility to like write Black people.
Right, for my people type of thing. Right. Yeah.
I think I would sound a little more pedantic than like I really need to, number one. And number two, I think I do think about it, just because, again, I do understand how I show up in spaces. I do understand that when I show up, I obviously look like a Black woman. I am a Black woman. It's something I proudly identify as. And I think that, although I feel the responsibility of writing from my experience, which is through a cultural lens, right? So like my experience is that I grew up in Black neighborhoods among Black people in Black spaces. You know what I mean? There was no sort of like, the only kind of experience that was kind of outside of that really for me was when I was an undergrad. going to a predominantly white institution, a PWI. And even that was kind of, I managed to kind of shift and mold my experience for it to be, to cater to even that lens that I was used to and familiar with, because the Black people were always going to, watch the other Black people, we're always going to make a space within a space, which is
sure.
So I think that with that said, I think just like any writer, I think as writers, we really need to understand and be thinking about what our end goal is. And so I think in Robin Lee's case, she had an end goal in mind. She said, I have been writing. And to your point, yeah, she wrote another story and it featured a Black woman with, I think, a white man, or it was kind of an interracial relationship. And she had been trying to write that book and get it published for years. Like she was like, I need to, I obviously want to be traditionally published. And she said, I think she said really in that article, she was just like, I don't want anything to stop me. And so if that was kind of for her, and I don't want this to sound as negative as it might sound, but if that was her compromise that she was willing to make and the hill she didn't want to die on, like, she was like, look, I want my story to be out there, because I think really too, her team is really creating this narrative of the story, not so much being about the interracial relationship, but really about a woman of a certain age group getting agency among her sexuality, agency, from a relationship perspective, this younger man, loving on this like older woman. And so, Gabrielle Union being a part of it, she's kind of like, oh, I have a younger man and I just love this story, and so like they're really trying to shift it away from that. And I think, frankly, with the article, it was a question that was asked that makes sense. And I think it kind of like blew up. You know what I mean? It was like, here's the question, and she answered it, and everyone was like, and it was kind of like, Black people are palatable. And I was like, oh God. And so to her credit, I think she was really just being honest, really about her experience. Like she said, look, I am a Black woman, but I'm also a Black woman who went to Harvard and Yale, and like her husband is French and white. Like she is coming from a specific lens that may not necessarily look from what I guess we deem to be used to, but it doesn't discount the experience that she has. And so, I think for a while, I was always looking to Black writers to feel the same way I did. It was like, oh, you have to want to like write Black stories for Black people. Like, don't you? And it's just like, I mean, that may or may not be that may not be my priority. Like that may be not something I'm trying to focus on right now. Like I really want this specific, I guess, trajectory for my career. And I'm willing to make that work, And so it's like,
and maybe not forever, right? Like that's the thing about it too. You talked about earlier that ebb and flow, right? And so just because you're writing Black characters for your first 3 or 4 books doesn't mean that by book 5 you might not be like, oh, I'm interested in something else. And so, I think the concept with Robin Lee's book is totally not her, right? It's not like particular to her. It's just the bigger picture of like, how do we look at that, and sometimes I'm really just like, it's fiction, y'all, like in a certain sense, right? Like, I feel like in a lot of ways we've got beholden to this like own voices space that can almost be like crippling in a way, right? Because I do think we should be able to write whatever we want, right? And you bring up such a great point about your end goal. I'm always telling people that like, A lot of times in the context of self-publishing versus traditional publishing, I'm just like, but what's your goal? You know what I mean? Because it's not about which one is better. It's like, what is your goal? Because as someone who has self-published, my goal was like, oh, I just needed more people, essentially, right? Like to be able to make it go farther. So that was how traditional publishing kind of came along, because I couldn't compare to where my book was. Like my book was everywhere. You know what I mean? Like I would go in stores and the book would be there, and I just didn't have the tools when I was self-publishing to have gotten to that space.
Right. And I think it's okay to admit that, right? Like I think we have this thing where it's like, you know, yes, we want to be artists and like we're doing this for us, but it's okay to say, you know, I'm an artist, but I really want to be in an airport. I really want my books to like, I want to walk into a Barnes and Noble and like see them stacked up like on the table of new releases. You know what I mean? And I think that, you know, it's a hard thing because again, Robin Lee's book was marketed in a specific way, you know, and funny enough, I read The Idea of You before it became this thing. And so I like stumbled on it, you know, the algorithms of Amazon, especially like at that time.
Because it was 2017 that it was released.
Right. It was 2017. So it was kind of like not as much of an influx as it is now. You know, we didn't have book talk, really. We didn't have kind of these like huge viral cultural moments about books. And so I kind of read it and was like, wow, this is a really great book. Like I hadn't even thought of like the concept of like, this is a white man with, you know, this woman. Like I just, and when I read books, I tend to kind of, again, cultural lens, everybody's Black. You know what I mean? When I read my books, it's like, that's kind of in my head. And so I just thought it was a great story about this like 40-year-old woman who, you know, it's kind of controversial, you know, it's the bandmate and the daughter's the fan. And, you know, it's kind of like, oh, this is nice. This is so messy. I like it. So it's just, it's funny because I think like from that time when it was released to now, she even said like it was such a surprise that it even reached the success that it did. And so I think honestly, what we're seeing is her adjusting to that success and popularity in real time because it was released, she had it out, it was published, and I think it was a little bit quiet. And then it became this huge thing during the pandemic. And it was like, whoa, you know? And so I think we have to understand again, like as writers, we have to be aware that the environments and the atmosphere that we're coming into, it's always changing. And so what's like really popular now could be totally not popular later. You know, we could have our moment within the first year of release, we could have our moment within 2 years. But, you know, from the time that she published that book in 2017, I'm sure she's a totally different writer than what she is now. And so she's having to come to grips with, okay, if I'm writing, if I'm doing, you know, several other books, what is that going to look like for me? So I think like, yeah, she's having this moment with The Idea of You, but she's probably trying to figure out how she's moving on and moving forward to whatever new project she has on the horizon. So it's interesting. It's like, yeah, it's like asking someone, well, how, you know, what do you think about your first child when you're on like the third? It's like, well, I don't, you know, I was writing that at that time, but I'm kind of like in a different place here, you know? Sure. So I understand the argument of like, being palatable could be jarring for an audience, especially when you, as an audience, as a reader who you attach to these writers, right? It's like, oh my God, like I loved the first book. I love the second book. I love the third book, you know, and then they drop the fourth book and it's like, why did they switch up? How did they switch up, you know, whatever subject or, you know, but it's like, you know, it's that conversation of like, oh, you know, she had to switch up to get the mass market or she had to, you know,
Or the nature of creativity, right?
Like the nature of creativity as the author. Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. I find that with music as well, right? So sometimes we like somebody in a certain space and then they're like, I want to try something, and, I think that, sometimes that happens. Sometimes there's other implications to your point. Same with music, right? Like sometimes there's the moment where people are like, okay, I've been doing what y'all like, but like, I'm trying to get on Billboard, and so sometimes they take that leap. And then there's other times where you're just like, I want to do something different. I find myself in that space right now, right? Where I'm trying to, normally I tell people like, you get over being on submission by writing something else because it's a slow process. You know what I mean? It's like people are trying to read a whole manuscript. So you could be on submission for like months, really. Mm-hmm. But I've been struggling trying to figure out what I want to write next. And I think, part of it is just like, what's interesting to me? You know what I mean? Like I have a ton of ideas, but I'm like, what's really interesting to me in this moment, right? That I really kind of want to see through. So I think sometimes we're always asking ourselves those questions. I guess before we get a little bit into a month of Sundays, I guess maybe my last thought on this kind of overall concept is around, and it's probably a good segue too, is around urban fiction and how it really had this moment in the 90s and early 2000s. And while it's still clearly like prevalent, like it still exists, where do you think there was a pivot where it wasn't as like mainstream? So urban fiction is an interesting thing, right? Because sometimes I don't all the way know what it means. So I'm not all the way talking about like always talking about like true to, there's like the true to the game urban fiction, but then there's like the fact that like also Terry McMillan gets put in those conversations where like totally different kind of context of like characters and stuff that she was writing about. But honestly, I think it's just sometimes when we're writing to other people's points, like really Black stories, they just kind of get put in that space. And like, I don't know, I just find myself even looking at my own work at times and being like, yeah, it's very out of that tradition, maybe just like evolved more though, than some of those, some of the books that, come on, like, let's be honest, and some of the books that we were reading back then, you read them now and you're like, okay. Which is a little bit more involved, but I guess like, I don't know. How do you feel like that shows up in today's literature? Because clearly, like, I guess maybe the good part is it all seems a little bit more integrated, right? So I remember going in the bookstore back in the day and there was the African-American literature section. And now I go into the big box retailers or, even other smaller indie bookstores and everybody's playing together, you know what I mean, at this point. But I don't know, like, if you have an idea, like where was the pivot, do you feel like? Because I just feel like when Terry McMillan was popular, there were just like so many other really prominent that were selling a lot of books. Because that's the other thing too, because we know the myth that like Black people don't read, which is like silly. But do you feel like there was a pivot? And if so, when or how do you feel like it's pivoted over the years?
That's a really good question. I do. And to answer your question, I do think there was a pivot. And just like on television, UPN, WB, it was slight, right? It was quiet. It was like a quiet shift, I think part of it is, I think unfortunately it was a restructuring from the ground up. I think like it started with, I think so much about that time of like a Terry McMillan who was huge. But also at that time, there was like Betty Ford and there were like other writers who are gems in my eyes, but managed to maybe publish one, maybe two, maybe 3, 4, 5 books, like they kind of managed to like get their projects out and kind of went away, and I don't know if it's because that time, I don't know if it was the demand of like keeping up, so to speak. I do think like when we think about those mid 2000s, we did have Terry, I think Bernice McFadden was also kind of in that mix too. Like it was very much like a moment. But
Michael Baisden. Who was the other? guy.
Omar Tyree.
Elin Harris.
Elin Harris. I was just going to say Elin. And I think, I think in that time, Black writers too kind of created a space for themselves. I think, I think Omar Tyree and Elin, I think they started out self-published actually. When self-publishing was like ghettoized, you know what I mean? It was like, you publishing your book and you selling it under the trunk. Like it was like, what are you doing? And I think, the moments that we say now are like, oh, going viral. Like they kind of went viral in their own way too, like it was to the point where, like, I think Omar says all the time, he was like, yo, I was selling my books and pushing them out of my trunk. And I did all that and became a bestseller, And so I think to a degree, it was like, I'm going to be so good. I'm going to make such an impact that you're not going to be able to ignore me. And, to a degree, there wasn't really, I don't think much of a recession now. It was a different kind of like socio-political landscape. I think even back then, even thinking about like Walter Mosley and like his stories and his work, like Bill Clinton was reading Devil in a Blue Dress. Like that was a moment, and like you had these kind of shifts in culture that like to that point, it kind of, once the shift in the industry kind of, you started seeing the less of those writers. I don't know if it was all the way the industry, nor do I think it was all the way the writer. I think like, similar to music, there was a point where I felt like everybody was kind of getting a deal. Like it was like, oh, all these people are, dropping hit songs or dropping these like one-off tracks, getting into these CDs. And it's just like, okay, was it the industry or was it just or kind of the bevy of resources available in the industry, or was it the artist, because again, I think like as artists, similar to what I was saying with having your end goal in mind, some writers I feel just want to maybe write that one book or write those two books or, and just kind of like disappear after that. You know what I mean? And so I think the timing of it was everything. And so I don't think there's really a straight answer of like where the shift happened, but it did happen. It was like, it went from like all of these writers that we saw at once that was in like constant conversation amongst each other to barely having one or two at all. So that is definitely a reality for sure.
But I think you bring up a great point in like in Renaissance, there's multiple things flourishing at the same time. And so to your point, because as soon as you said like TV, it made sense because I was like, yeah, that was like a golden age of Black TV. And we all know there was that lull there. And we find ourselves, back in a space where we are seeing shows, even though y'all canceling them after 1 and 2 seasons, because I'm still tight about Rapish. I'm still tight about it because season 3 was about to go off. But anyway, yes. Stay focused. And and infrastructure is important, right? So I think we're still in a space where there's diverse books. There's a lot of great Black and POC authors like releasing really great stuff, but it's kind of like, where's the gathering place? Where, and, I'm always bothering my writing friends because I'm like, we should take a picture because I think about those old photos that I see of Tony and Alice Walker and June Jordan and those folks, and the moment of like collective power, what it really means, how it's transformative in publishing. And I think we have a really great opportunity now because listen, 2020 I got my book deal in 2020. Okay. So that's what we're going to see how it goes.
Listen, and you were taking advantage of the time, right? So like,
I wasn't technically, it just so happened. I started writing my book in 2017. So it was not about and I got told no all of 2019 before 2020 ever happened. So, but there was a space, right, where clearly a lot of, most of the people I talk to that are debuts that are Black or POC, they're like, yeah, I got my book deal in 2020. So, there's these moments of rise, but I think what's important for us is like keeping the infrastructure and keeping our collective power, right? Like,
yeah,
to really continue to transform things. So I guess with that, I wanted to ask you about the book. So tell us a little bit about A Month of Sundays. Just tell us the elevator pitch about what the book is about and what that process has been like for you.
Yeah, so A Month of Sundays is a contemporary romance novel. There is DeAndre Harrison, who is a GOAT tennis player. He's like a legend. And it's DeAndre and Imani Wright, who is the female heroine, the love interest. And she is a visual artist as well as an art curator. They first meet at a mutual friend's wedding. It's an instant connection that neither one of them can deny, even though Imani kind of denies it. They end up meeting each other about 4 years later at another mutual friend's birthday party. And DeAndre figures out a way to get her back in his life.
Ooh, I love it. First of all, I love these professions because that is something I've been struggling with recently too. Like what the people are going to do. Because I'm like,
what are they going to do with it? What are they going to do to the pages?
Yes. And like, because I'm just like, I'm so engraved in like creativity and like entertainment that I'm like, everybody can't be in entertainment. Like, I feel like whatever I need to write next needs to be like regular occupations. So I love that DeAndre is a tennis player because it's just kind of left field, and that Imani, right? Imani is is a visual artist, because I'm just like, oh, okay, those are cool different professions to think about.
It's fun. It's definitely, and professions for me allow a lot of conversations to be brought up outside of, yes, it's a love story and they give me all the feels and I appreciate that. But there are definitely like a lot of ideas and conversation about what success means, for especially Black people, Black people in white spaces. Especially in Imani's case, she's an artist. So she's trying to figure out that balance of like, okay, what am I trying to say as an artist, as a creative Black woman? But also trying to figure that out along with being with a very, very skilled man, a very like skilled man who also is able to provide her with these resources that she couldn't even fathom. And so it's like, how does she reconcile with that and being an artist of her time with something to say? And so I appreciate it, kind of looking at it from that perspective, and believe it or not, kind of their careers came before they did in a way. So it's interesting. I'm excited about it.
I love kind of what leads us to the story, because I feel like maybe much to like, I got to do better next time, but I almost feel like Tao was more fleshed out as a character in my mind than Carly, even though Carly was the main protagonist.
That you say that, Ashley. I don't feel that way.
Well, I love that you don't feel that way, but in my mind, because okay, I will say this: maybe I did my job in revision, because earlier drafts, people were like, I don't get a feel from Carly. Like, who is she? What is happening?
I think there's also
I did a better job.
There's also a pressure with like female characters. That is the hill I will die on. Like, I think it is a harder sell for female characters in general because of how, our prescriptions of women and like how we think they need to show up. So like, I felt her, Ashley. Okay. Like, I appreciate that. You did that.
I appreciate this, y'all. This is why it's good to have family on the pod, because they lift you up. So when you were writing A Month of Sundays, what do you feel like was the most rewarding part of writing the book? And what do you feel like was the most challenging part of writing the book?
The most rewarding part about writing the book was finishing it.
Makes sense.
I'm going to be totally transparent about that. I think along the way, though, to get to that point of finishing it, were definitely just the moments that I kind of just described to you, like the moments of like discovering what these characters are about. I think for like the first thousands of words, actually, when I do write, I have no idea who these people are. Like it's a constant battle of just like, okay, I got to just get to a point. And usually that's around like the 30,000, 40,000 word mark where it's like, okay, I got to reach this point, because before then it's like, okay, y'all are people that I believe in my mind are fully fleshed out. I just need to discover it. And so it's kind of like, all right, I'm going to get there. I'm going to get there. I'm going to get there. But once I did, it felt like the floodgates opened up. It was like, oh, I know exactly what you're about now. I know exactly how you would respond. I know exactly why you're kind of responding the way you are here. And so the rewarding part of it was really getting to know the characters and really making them feel as real as they are. So that's always the best part for me.
I feel like I love that you brought that up, because I think we don't talk enough about the work that happens outside of just writing like exposition and dialogue. Like, you know what I mean? So yes, you get at your computer and you write lovely words of prose and dialogue. However, there's really, and then I think this is why books take so long sometimes, like why it takes years sometimes to write books, because you have these other moments where, for one of my characters, I had to write journal entries from him to just be in his mind, because he, to me, had a very like melancholy kind of complex mind. So you just kind of like literally needing to like walk and
step into that space.
Yeah, in that space, and like from the character's perspective. And I think sometimes when people are aspiring to write a book, I don't know, they just think it's this thing of just like writing a book. But there's all this exploration, and sitting with it and things gelling. So you're giving me optimism that this 26K word project that I'm on, like when I get to 30, gonna feel right.
Yeah, you're gonna feel
right now. Actually, it still feels like a piece of something that I'm trying to figure out, but 4,000 more words and it'll all gel.
And I always say too, like I wrote DeAndre and Imani's story in the middle of a postpartum depression. So I was feeling the exact opposite of like how DeAndre is, right? So I think like on a subconscious level, I was like searching for something outside of me, to feel something like, in my case, to feel a sense of assurance, right? And so I kind of leaned into that feeling of like, okay, I know that this person looks to be so strong and put together on the outside, but there's more to him than that. And so even in the midst of that, how does he show up, And so it's like, I think any writer who is kind of struggling with that, I think it's like leaning into what we may not even see in ourselves at the moment. I think that can provide such a great jumping off point, with what we have to write.
Oh, absolutely. Listen, Carly was entertained in LA, and then all of a sudden I was in Los Angeles, and I said, what? what in the world did I just write? So I guess before we jump into our ending segments, tell us something that you just want people to know about the book. Like if they're, by the time this episode airs, the book will be out. So grab it, support, make sure to actually put your money where your mouth is when you support Black writers. When you say you support Black writers, that means writing reviews. That means getting the book. Y'all, my house is overflowing with friends' books. I'm going to be poor because I know how hard it is to sell books. So I buy all my friends' books. But yeah, is there anything about the story that you would just want to impart on the audience?
I think the story, I think anyone who are fans of just work that you can have conversations about, I think on the surface, DeAndre is kind of the the man's man. You know what I mean? He shows up very strong and he shows up very like present in himself and like kind of cocky, kind of arrogant, but has like a heart of gold. And Imani's kind of like this very sweet, character. So it's easy to like fall in love with them just on the surface. But I think like any reader who is willing to really sink their teeth into a work that really they can reflect on. I'm a fan of writers who I can reread, so like my experience with like A Waiting to Exhale is totally different reading it now than I did even back then. And so I really kind of pray that, whomever does come across it and does read it, can kind of give it time to get into your bones a little bit. It's not the fastest read in the world, but it is a build, and it is, I think, something that's impactful. And I think like anyone who is into love stories and romance and just like, I guess what they call it, soft life, they'll definitely be interested in that for sure.
Love it. Well, we'll definitely link to the book for you all to make sure and pick it up. Yes. So getting into our segment that we call the canon, we like to expose, of course, our audience to other writers that they should check out. And so we have a couple areas of criteria that we just will want you to highlight a writer that exhibits that. So the first one is, who is a writer whose online or public persona you love?
A writer a persona who I can relate to. She's an indie writer. Her name is Christina C. Jones.
I've seen that name.
Yeah. She's been independently published for a very long time now. She's kind of like an OG, kind of in that independent Black romance space. And I say I respect her presence because she's actively like working on it in real time. And the fact that she's working on it without any sort of reservations, it seems like she's just kind of like showing up. Like she's just kind of like, okay, I had a writing day today that I thought went one way, but it actually didn't. She is a mom to an infant now. And so she talks about her struggles with that. And so she's really like building community in real time. And I can appreciate that she's doing it in a way that's authentic to her. And she's not trying to front for like, the means of like showing up the right way or showing up properly. And I think like we're in a phase and kind of in an era nowadays where it's like, yeah, social media is very controversial. But it does offer the space and the opportunity to really show up as you are and kind of like get the community and get the people who care about you to really support you and come to you. And so I think she's doing just a phenomenal job.
Love it. How about for writing voice? Whose writing voice are you just like, that's it?
Oh my gosh. I mean, from a perspective of just, I can't choose one, so I'm going to just choose two. I know.
Totally fine.
But it will always be, for me, Tia Williams. Like, her writing voice is like, I'm just so proud of like her ascension now, because I've been like reading her since like It Chicks and like the work from that time and her still being an editor to like now she's just this huge, she's building these cultural moments, right? Where it's just like you had 7 Days in June and now you have, Ricky Wilde. And it's just like, we're all so proud of her. Like, and her voice has always been that way. Like and not saying she hasn't grown, but like her voice has always been kind of like, this is who I'm writing and this is who I'm writing it for. Like I'm writing for Black women and I'm not changing that. And so I will always stand Tia Williams. And Kennedy Ryan, of course. Kennedy, she is like, I think, having such a great moment now of just being, again, a Black woman who I feel like in real time is like having just amazing moments. Like her team, her support that is around her from like a traditional publishing perspective is impressive. And like she, I think, is wanting to create her voice outside of just like, you know, I'm publishing like a love story. Like she's trying to really take so many different topics and issues that are kind of considered taboo in some of our spaces. And she's like bringing it to readers who aren't that familiar with a romance. You know, she's bringing it to more of an audience who can read her and then say, oh, there are other writers who are doing this. You know what I mean? And so it's like, you know, I think we talk a little bit about like tokenism, so to speak, sometimes. And I don't necessarily always think that's a bad thing. I think like it's great that she does have the platform that she does, because she's then talking so much about the Black writers who are doing it. And so I think her voice is very needed. She's doing a great job.
That's good. Listen, talking to people will definitely start generating ideas in your mind. So it's like, I just thought
she's like, can I write that down?
I know. I'm like, I just thought of a story. But yes, that's a dynamic duo. I mean, listen, I aspire. I've been watching all their book promo for Ricky Wilde and for
and together they're like doing this like tag teaming thing, which I appreciate.
Yes, so I aspire because I'm like Jonna Henry, who is our assistant here at Permission to Write. She like happened upon a Kennedy Ryan book talk in Philly. Like she just was out and saw and pulled up to it and sent us some video and stuff to put on our content. But I was like, it's so full. Listen, y'all, it'd be like, let's be honest. Every writer has been to an event with like 3 people. I have. Okay. I've been to full events, and I've also
and clapping and laughing at the times you need to. Just
listen. I have been.
You can show your support. You're like,
I have had full events as an author. I have had events with 3 people, and I talk to those 3 people, because whether it's 3 or 3, you sell one book at a time.
Yeah.
But those Kennedy Ryan book events, they've been packed.
Moments, but it also shows like what could be.
Sure.
You know what I mean? Like, it's like, I think for so long we were, you know, there was like this idea like, okay, I know what I think I want, but I don't know how it would look. And it's like, you see it clearly with Kennedy. She's packing it out. She's on Good Morning America. She's not like friends of mine who really don't read like that in terms of like how, you know, others do read or consider themselves voracious readers. They're like, oh yeah, I should read that Kennedy Ryan book. Like, yeah,
and she's kind of like done that dance between, I think, self-publishing and traditional publishing too, even with some of her stuff being re-released. So absolutely a great blueprint. What about word choice, like command of language?
I don't know. I was thinking about this. Word choice. So I want to say, again, she's another indie writer who I appreciate and love. Well, actually, I don't think she's independently published. I think she's still traditionally published. But I think she's a name that I often don't hear about. And I think I did mention her earlier, Bernice McFadden. Bernice always has such a command of language to me. I think that she is... the topic of underrated is so like, I go back and forth with that term.
It's tough because I tend to feel like that about Diane McKinney Whetstone and J. California Cooper. I'm like, they don't get mentioned enough. I don't know why. I don't know what's happening. They don't get mentioned enough.
I don't get it. But with that said, like every time I read a Bernice book, it's just like another level to me of just like language that's accessible, but at the same time, it stretches you. And that's really hard to do. And Bernice has even been open about the fact that, like, first of all, like, to me, one of my favorite work of hers, hands down, has to be Sugar. Sugar is such a iconic novel of hers to me, and she has said like, "Oh, I wrote it, and I know my writing is much better than it was then." And you're just like, "But it's such a classic. What are you talking about?" But it just goes to show that, like, again, your growth as a writer is something that I think as writers we all should be yielding to. And you can tell that book after book, she's constantly up on her craft. She's constantly working on it, constantly just like taking it seriously, being intentional with every word that she writes. And like, she forces me to slow down, which is something that's like, I think we got to appreciate being able to do. And so I just love her work, and I'm always going to try to like sneak in her name every once in a while because I so appreciate her.
We all have those, and I'm not as familiar. I feel like I have a lot of friends that are big fans of hers, and it's just by nature of there's a lot of books, and so sometimes I have to just like get to it. But I've made them into.
She was up there. She was up there with Terry too. Like she and Terry were kind of hanging strong and everything. Kind of, I guess, in bookshelf, if you want to talk about it like that.
Sure.
But yeah,
at that time, my reading palette was really based off my mother. So because my mother probably read more Terry McMillan, I read more Terry McMillan at the time. So, but I definitely, I'm logging because a lot of people have been telling me about Bernice McFadden. So I have to just like
Sugar, later work, the Book of Harlan, always recommend it.
I have a Barnes & Noble gift card. I got it. I'm on it. I'm on it. All right. So to wrap us up, we want to go through our lightning round of writing cliches. So it's a yay or nay. We're going to go through a couple writing cliches. You tell us yay or nay. All right.
Okay.
Ready? Here we go.
Okay.
Writing every day.
Oh gosh, this is so hard. I want to say yay, just for like logically, but nay in terms of like what my reality
practicality. Love it. Write drunk, edit sober.
Yay.
Love it. You cannot draft and edit at the same time.
Nay.
I like that. That's different. Show, don't tell.
Yay.
Okay. Kill your darlings.
Yay.
Yeah. Yay. My first edit letter was a very good lesson in killing.
Yeah.
The stuff that you're like, I just like that. And they're like, it doesn't move the story forward.
It doesn't move the story forward. But like, not all killings means like delete it forever. It could mean just placing it somewhere else, which is what I do.
Plagiarize yourself. Just like lift some copy from one thing, put it in something else. Sometimes there's just lines that I like, and I'm like, oh, I'm gonna put this line somewhere. Yeah. Yep. Love it. Oxford comma is our last and most controversial point.
Oh. I love the Oxford comma. I'm not even gonna lie. My editor hates me, but yes, yay. I love the Oxford comma.
Listen, I am a girl of an Oxford comma.
I love it.
Yeah, listen, it's our most controversial point. I don't know how, but it is. The Oxford comma. Well, you heard it here first. Jade Olivia is with the Oxford comma. She is a girl of my world. Yeah. So I want to thank you so much for joining me. Thanks to everyone for listening. And of course, thanks for Jade for having this wonderful, insightful conversation. Make sure that you all go and grab her book, and we will see you all next time. Bye, y'all. Thank you for listening to the Permission to Write podcast. We hope you enjoyed the show. Plug into our community that works to cultivate and amplify the voices of Black writers and writers of color by visiting permissiontowrite.com. We'll see you next time.